I want to thank I want to thank everybody for joining us today, all of the people who are watching in the webinar, those of you who are joining us on YouTube. I also want to make a special thanks, of course, to our panelists for taking some time to this afternoon or this evening to be here, wherever you're joining us from. And before we begin, my name is Christy Thornton. I'm the co-director of the History and Political Economy Project, together with Quinn Slobodian. I'm an associate professor of history at NYU. And I want to make a couple of thank yous as we begin here. Special thanks, of course, to the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, who we are partnering with for this series of webinars, and especially to Samantha Igo for her administrative help. We wouldn't be able to do this without her. And of course, also a huge thanks to our postdoctoral fellow at the HPE project, Andrew Anastasi, who has also done a heroic lift in organizing this webinar series. So my personal thanks and thanks to the HPE project to both of those folks. As I mentioned, this is the second in a series of webinars organized by the History and Political Economy Project for an initiative we're calling Histories and Futures of Global Governance. This project, which is supported by the Open Society Foundation, Education and Ideas Collaborative, is trying to bring together historians, policymakers, reform advocates, and others to address how and why, and maybe even if history can matter for histories of global governance reform efforts that are ongoing today. So we held a first webinar. Some of you may have attended that in February with Adriana Abdenour, Jamie Martin, and Richard Kozel-Wright. And that webinar addressed the kind of long history of efforts to reform institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. And so today we wanted to specifically zoom in on Global South perspectives about such reform, a topic that I've addressed in my own historical work in the context of Latin America and particularly Mexico, and that all of our panelists have worked on in various ways. So to just kind of set the stance of the global economy, and the consequences of continuing the status quo as we have been doing are quite dire, right? Failures to meet the needs for climate finance, pandemic preparedness, debt relief, and technology transfer will only continue to exacerbate inequalities both between and within countries, leading, of course, to further political destabilization in a very already destabilized world. But for many observers like myself, today's calls for reform of the institutions of global governance continue to provoke a strong sense of déjà vu. This is far from the first time that calls for such reforms have been demanded. So historians have shown in recent years, questions of equity, sovereignty, collective decision-making have been central to struggles over global governance from the earliest days of each of these institutions, indeed from the very beginning. So 80 years after the earliest debates over voice and vote at the IMF and World Bank, as I detailed in my first book, why are these calls still necessary? And how should we understand the kind of perpetual cycle of reformism and its results? One thing that we think is that many of the tools and frameworks created by earlier moments of reform, the creation of special drawing rights, the sustainable development goals, the debt management facility, these things are proving insufficient to meet the challenges that we face today. So this webinar series and a conference we're planning to host next year are intended to ask, what lessons should we be taking from prior struggles over the structure of the global economic system for reform efforts that are going on today? And how can an engagement with the history of reform inform ongoing conversations about creating a global governance system that can actually meet the challenges of today's many crises? So to answer these questions, we have a really exciting panel joining us today. I'm really grateful to our panelists. So I'm going to briefly introduce them now before beginning our conversation. We'll try to save some time at the end for a few questions from those of you who are joining us in the audience. And so if you do have questions you'd like us to address, please use the Q&A function in the webinar. First, we have Anush Kapadia. He is an associate professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Bombay. He works on the political economy of money, banking, and financial systems. And his most recent book is a book titled A Political Theory of Money, published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. He's also the primary investigator on the New Political Economy Initiative, a project that aims to broaden social science approaches to studying the economy. Robert Wade is a New Zealander whose research career started with fieldwork in Pitcairn Island in the South Pacific, continued in central Italy, where he's joining us from today, then South Korea, then Taiwan, and then inside the World Bank on the World Bank. The invisible thread of his career has been the question of how the opportunities for material prosperity available to most Westerners of his generation could also be available to most of the world's population. He's worked at the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex, the World Bank, Princeton, MIT, and Brown before joining LSE, where he is now. His book, Governing the Market, received the Best Book in Political Economy Award from the American Political Science Association, and he won the Leontief Prize in Economics in 2008. Our final panelist is Andres Arauz, who is an Ecuadorian economist. He was the subject of the 2024 film, The Ecuadorian Candidate, which followed his campaign for president of Ecuador in the 2021 election. And before that, he was Minister of Knowledge and Human Talent from 2015 to 2017, and Minister of Culture in 2017 in the Ecuadorian government. He's been a senior research fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and he's an academic and policy researcher with expertise on money and technology, government procurement and development planning and macroeconomics, illicit financial flows, and finance. He obtained his PhD in financial economics from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Welcome. I think to get us started, what I'd like to do is this conversation is intended to address questions of global governance reform from the perspective, particularly of the Global South. So I'd like to ask each of you to kind of set the table for us as to what difference a Southern perspective makes to the question of reforming institutions of global economic governance. I think we've all had experiences of butting up against the kind of Eurocentrism and global North biases in our own research, in your advocacy work. And so it was important to the HPE project to focus explicitly on this question of what this looks like from the Global South. So what for each of you does a particular Global South perspective bring to the conversation? Maybe we can start with Anush.
Well, thanks, Rishi, and I hope I'm audible. Thanks to you and your team for the invitation, and I'm sure I'll learn much more than I'll contribute. But I think the Global South perspective, and you mentioned questions recurring again and again and again, like some sort of repressed memory. But this is not a repressed memory for us. This is everyday life, and I think that we keep coming back to these questions because we've been facing the same structural questions for the entire post-war period, indeed, perhaps even longer into the colonial period. India imports 80% of its energy. Now we cover over that through various international flows, and I can talk about how those are vulnerable and so on and so forth. But the condition of dependency still characterizes most countries in the Global South. We export primary goods on the most part. We import, higher value goods. And that good old Singer-Prebisch kind of dynamic for me is still very much a live reality. I think only a few countries have successfully escaped from empire, to use Alice Amsden's phrase. And it's hard. It's super hard. You need geopolitical conditions. You need domestic political conditions. You need domestic structures. Robert has talked about this, of course, extensively. A lot of things have to go right. And India is perhaps famous for missing opportunities, and another opportunity is sort of opening it up now with China Plus One, and there's a lot of movement around that, as you can imagine. It's not like a country like India it's obviously a mixed bag. There's a lot of dualism. But if you're asking sort of from the perspective of the Global South, I think foregrounding that structural dependency is, I think, very, very important. And that's just not from the Southern perspective. The Southern perspective enables us to see that structural fact about the global economy. It's a highly unequal place. And there are sort of two layers of hierarchy that I'm particularly interested in. There's the sort of financial layer, but that's driven by, in a sense, the trade deficit. And even if countries have a trade surplus in the Global South, which they rarely do, those surpluses are backed by commodity price flows, and commodity prices are volatile, and so there's vulnerability there. So a sort of underlying real economic vulnerability then leads to a financial vulnerability. If you have a trade deficit, you have to borrow. That makes you dependent on the sovereign debt markets, on the foreign exchange markets. And I think it's really actually those markets, we can come back to this in a bit, but I think it's those markets in the first instance that are intermediating global flows. The Global South doesn't bank with the World Bank or the IMF. They do some trade at the margin, but they're not really price setters. They're really the dollar-dominated system that is undergirded by the balance sheet of a sovereign, a very large sovereign, but that has these massive outworks that stretch the euro-dollar market and so on and so forth. That's really the financial structure that we have to deal with. And then the second hierarchy is the technological one. Again, this is we've known this for a very long time. The new international economic order um, was primarily oriented. His vision was oriented around creating a trade and financial system that would enable the upgrading of firms in the global south. Now, of course, there are massive domestic predicates for this, so it's not you can't put all the blame on the international structure. We have agency too, of course. um, but unless we have a trading and financial system that enables a kind of uh, dry dock within which we can experiment with local firms, discipline them at the same time, move them up the value chain in very much in the way that the East Asian states were able to do. Of course, we can't copy them either. Each of us has to come up with our own kind of solution, and we're not all going to be autarkic. We're still going to have some require some collective action at the global level. That collective action is a little hostile, but I mean, in a nutshell, let me just say that it's that foregrounding that structural piece, and then that gives us a target for reform.
Great. Thank you. Andres, what about from your perspective?
Yeah, well, and again, thanks for the invitation. Happy to be here. I mean, coming from a global South perspective, especially one of a Latin American tradition, where there have been a series of attempts at escaping from dependency through structuralist efforts, import substitution efforts, and developmentalist efforts. I think development is a sort of a key undertone and an implicit objective of all the policy design that's attempted in terms of the international financial architecture. But I think Anush nailed it when he talked about the hierarchies, right? So when you're in the global South, when you see the entire system, the rules, the public international law, the correspondent banking system, the trade rules, the rates of the tariffs, and so on, all the time you're thinking about hierarchy. It's a positioning issue. And it's vital to understand how we see the international issues. It is not a level playing field. It is not, for example, if you analyze WTO law or like the GATT, there is so much implicit as if you were talking about two equally positioned agents when you have so asymmetries that are so huge in terms of endowments of power, in terms of political economy, but also these embedded hierarchies into the system. So I think thinking of hierarchies is essential when you are from the global South, and how to go up just a little bit in those hierarchies, not just in terms of the value chain or finding policy space in the international public law as with regards to the trading system, the financial system, and so on, but also in terms of basically political power. And that's when you understand that one single country from the global South will have zero chance of succeeding, that you necessarily have to get a minimum threshold of global South countries that can go together in these efforts at going up the international hierarchy. And that's when you have the collective action problem and the issue of how to coordinate these, what I have called in the past, unilateral but coordinated efforts, as in, if you just ask for someone to give you better deals, that won't happen. If you do it by yourself, it won't happen either. But if you agree with a minimum number of countries to pursue a common goal and actually dare to take the measures simultaneously, you may then have a possibility of success in going up these hierarchies. And in the contemporary sense, there are so many issues that have these hierarchies embedded. For example, when you talk about alternative financial systems or creditors, sure, that sounds nice, but what's happening is that they end up going through the US financial system anyway, or through the UK legal system anyway. Or if you want to talk about issues like the G20, going from G7 to G20, oh, that's nice. We have now democratized and included the global South. But de facto, we know that it's an issue run basically by the US Treasury. And when we have a system that currently has the United States as the veto holder in the IMF, in the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions, then you realize the system itself is constructed in such a way where these hierarchies are absolutely embedded in the system. And I think it requires thinking about how to create alliances between the global South, necessarily with allies in the global North, particularly in the United States, particularly in the United States Congress, that becomes the veto setter for the transformation of the international financial system.
Great. Putting on the table these questions of the kind of the structural dependencies, the questions of hierarchy, the questions of political power are obviously really key. And in my work, I see this going all the way back to, early conversations in the beginning of the 1930s about setting up these kinds of institutions and how the balance would be struck. Robert, do you have anything to add here?
Yes, I wanted to follow up some points that Andreas was making, with reference specifically to the governance of the World Bank and the IMF. And so these points are fairly well known, but they are nevertheless very important to bring out. First of all, countries in the global South, most of them at least, are very underrepresented in terms of their share of quota and votes in both organizations. And the Europeans in particular or many of the Europeans are very overrepresented in terms of these things. And it's not just share of votes, but also places in the board of executive directors, the seats and the board of executive directors. And they are underrepresented in terms of the quota formula itself. That is, the quota formula is constructed in a way which gives an advantage to the West. And just one particular example of this is that the calculation of a country's share of world GDP is weighted at 60% GDP at market exchange rates and 40% at purchasing power parity. And for a long time, executive directors from developing countries have pressed for at least a 50-50 weighting of market exchange rates and purchasing power parity. And their preference is 60% purchasing power parity and 40% market exchange rates. But the northern countries say no. They are agreed on saying no. So so that's what happens by the formula. But then by processes that are not at all clear, the distribution by the formula is then adjusted in, let's say, underwear politics kind of ways, so that the actual distribution of votes and quota differs from that prescribed by the formula. And that's another issue in which many countries of the global South are disadvantaged, because their prime minister cannot ring up the president of the World Bank and demand that their country get more share than some other country, as can some countries of the West at least. And then you have, as Andreas said, this basic structural point that the US is the only country with a veto. But it's not just that, it's also that the US has the monopoly on the presidency of the World Bank, and this is much less known, the US has the monopoly on the number 2 position in the IMF. So this also builds in a strong bias in favor of Western powers. And just to elaborate that point about the underwear politics, the fact that the US Treasury Secretary is the main chooser of who should be the next president of the World Bank means that the president of the World Bank is indebted to and probably close personally to the US Treasury Secretary, which means that as the US Treasury Secretary is being driven home in the evening, he or she feels free to ring up the president of the World Bank and just have a nice conversation about what's happening in various parts of the world and what the US would like to see happening in various parts of the world. Now, none of this gets into the documentation, of course, but nevertheless, it's yet another mechanism by which the US basically runs the bank and to a degree the fund as a kind of almost like an extension of US foreign and treasury policy. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but there's a substantial amount of truth to that point, that they are run as something like extensions of US policy, which is why I think, and I'll make this my last point now, which is why I think that the recommendation in Project 2025 that the US exit from the bank and the fund is one of their recommendations which the US is unlikely to follow. And that's because the US, once it leaves, gets no leverage. Not just that it gets no leverage, it's also that by the Articles of Agreement, the headquarters of the bank and the fund would have to move from Washington to the country with the biggest GDP in the world. And guess what that country is? That country is China. Well, even the Trump administration, faced with that prospect, would probably draw back from the idea of leaving. So I'll stop at that point.
Great. This is also helpful. One of the things that really strikes me is that the kind of conditions that you've all pointed to, the structural dependency, these embedded hierarchies, the way that the United States maintains this veto power, the overweighting of the European countries, right? These are things that countries from the global south have been arguing against, have been fighting against, have been trying to do these sort of collective action against literally for the entire history of these institutions, right? We see these important moments. I think there is some sense in which the creation of UNCTAD in the 1960s, right? The move towards the new international economic order, these kind of various moments when it seems as though there is sort of collective power for reform, or at least collective will. And then over and over again, those kinds of reforms are blocked in ways that quite frequently sort of take into consideration some of the kind of rhetorical flourishes of the push for reform, but change very little about the structures, right? And so I wonder from each of your perspectives about why it is that these institutions, continue this way. When reform is nominally on the agenda, has been on the agenda of these institutions, right? Since at least the 1960s, right? McNamara was doing reform. Every leader comes in and says that they hear the criticism, they're ready for reform. So in our first webinar, Adriana Abdenoor pointed to kind of bureaucratic stasis as part of this resistance, that it's part of sort of how the institutions continue to work. And Richard Kozel-Wright highlighted the mechanism of consensus building as an actual constraint on change, that it's actually frequently not a kind of brute force vote, but an attempt to kind of, come to a consensus, and that gives those with more power much more chance to influence that. Robert, I know that, for instance, you have pointed to the existence of what you've called zombie ideas, sort of continuing in these institutions. And so I guess from each of your perspectives, what is it that makes it so that we have these conversations about reform over and over again, and yet we're still diagnosing the same conditions of power? Do you want to start there, Robert?
I was hoping you would ask somebody else, but okay, I will make one point, which is this. You have to remember that the US is unlike other states in that it is a bifurcated principle in the sense that the main interlocutors between the US and these organizations, the bank and the fund, is not just the executive branch. It's the executive branch, and it's also separately the Congress. And the only significant country in the world which has this bifurcated principle is the United States. And that adds many obstacles to reform. And I'll just give you one illustration. So in 2010, the IMF went through an elaborate negotiation to reallocate, to change the distribution of quota and therefore votes. And it was a long process, but eventually the Board of Governors and the Board of Executive Directors agreed on a reallocation. That was in 2010. And but it was not implemented until 2015. For 5 years, it was not implemented. Why? Because the US Congress would not approve the implications, the financial implications for the United States contributing more money to the IMF. And the reason why the US Congress would not approve goes like this. The Treasury would send people up to the Hill and their people would go knocking on doors of congressmen and women saying, we want your approval for an increase in US contributions to the IMF. And the congressman or woman would say back, look, my constituents don't know anything about the IMF. They don't care about the IMF. If you want my vote, you have to give me X, Y, and Z, which is for my constituents. And the Treasury added up the total cost of getting congressional approval and found that it was just way too high. And therefore, the Treasury was not able to get approval from the Congress for this for 5 years. I'm not quite sure what happened after 5 years to enable the Treasury to get approval from Congress, but that's just one major blockage to some of these reforms. The fact that the US is a bifurcated principle and the Congress basically is not all that, or rather individual congressmen and women are not very keen to encourage the organizations unless they individually can get good deals back from the Treasury in return.
Mm-hmm. Such an important point. Andres, how do you see it, the kind of continual, perpetual cycle of reform and what it is that continues to block us here?
I would be a little bit more skeptical of arguments around bureaucratic inertia or just sort of lack of technical arguments or whatever. I mean, the arguments have been on the table forever, literally, and ever since you mentioned the foundation of UNCTAD, there's been a lot of brain power there and a lot of history and a lot of work and a lot of research that has been done that does not justify the current rules of the game. So it is really an issue about power, right? It is an issue about power, and it becomes relevant to study the inner workings of power dynamics, right? And in this case, political economy issues around reform. One of the things that I think is very relevant to understand how this is playing out currently, 2025 or almost a quarter into the 21st century, is the issue of sanctions and unilateral coercive measures and how that interplays with the way the system is built in such a hierarchical manner, right? So, I mean, these sanctions, if they were established, I don't know, by Thailand against African countries or whatever, would be absolutely irrelevant. Or if Peru establishes sanctions against European countries, that would be irrelevant. But it's the fact that those at the top of the hierarchy are setting the sanctions and the unilateral coercive measures, the fact that they become globally systemic issues, where this power is withdrawn from the invisible underwear politics that Robert mentioned and come right front and racism with embedded language openly, similar and akin to that of war, right? So we start to see how the hierarchies and the system, how it was built, has been weaponized, right? Has been weaponized, but in more explicit terms nowadays than perhaps before. So that is paradoxically an open crack in the system, because the success of hegemony is that you can do it quietly and with the collaboration of all the players. But if you start to weaponize that and the violence becomes explicit, then the legitimacy of that system gets some of the cracks open. So I think that studying, the political economy of these unilateral coercive measures, which is the language the UN adopts for sanctions, is something crucial into how this opens possibilities for reform of the international monetary system, payment systems around the world, the dynamics of the interplay between these measures like OFAC and Treasury in comparison to, for example, the United Nations Security Council, which also establishes not unilateral but multilateral or global coercive measures and so on, and how that interplay of political economy of sanctions and the cracks that are thereby opened in the international financial architecture are absolutely crucial. And then I also wanted to say something perhaps in the other direction, which is actually proof that you do have some changes when they are done masterfully, with perhaps not so much noise, but with very, very smart people working on very specific issues that have maximum power, which is the evolution of the SDR system ever since its creation in the late 60s. So, at that time, the United States agreed to create this special new monetary unit called the SDR in the late 60s, which then grew a bit in the 70s. Of course, it was forgotten for a very long time. But then, in this century, you have had an increase of this instrument. You had, during the Obama government, the inclusion of the Chinese currency in the SDR basket. And these are not minor issues. These are systemic changes, but that were done with enough shrewdness at the time that did not cause major overhaul or systemic crisis in the system, but that were able to happen. There were actually changes that happen in real life. So I think if we can also, at the same time that we work on major political economy issues, power distribution issues, governance issues, and so on, also work with very specific methodological changes, accounting changes, technical changes that can have maximum impact, can also happen.
That's great. And Anush, I want to come to you on those kinds of technical changes and things that you have seen that you think might be important. But I think you're highlighting, Andres, this idea of that one of the ways that the United States especially holds power in this system is not just sort of its ability to impose its will through these multilateral fora, but its ability to choose to then act unilaterally when it wants to, right? To set the rules of the game and then choose to ignore them when it is deemed, convenient for the United States. And that is obviously a power that the other member states who are part of this don't have. And, in 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, that was the most obvious moment, right? And you had the countries of the global South say, why did we sign up to this multilateral thing that all of a sudden the United States can just kind of blow up and then put a massive import tax on the rest of us, right? So that power to both set the rules of the game and then ignore those rules when the United States wants is clearly an important thing going on here. What do you think, Anush?
Well, the sovereign calls the exception. But let me take a little bit of issue with this focus on reform of the Bretton Woods institutions. It's not that they're not important. They are important, of course. But I think, especially among progressives, the amount of heat and light devoted to reform of the Bretton Woods systems is, I think, a little disproportionate to their structural importance. Allow me to, let's run a thought experiment. If tomorrow voting power is democratized and SDRs increase, is that really going to change the structure of the system? So I would take a little bit of the issue with what Andreas is saying, that I've written a book on money, and I don't want to bore you with the details of why SDRs can't be money. I have a whole chapter on it. Why SDRs can't be world money. there's not enough of them around, and people don't bank in them. Right? The system is a dollar-based system because the dollar is, has 20% of the global GDP in one instrument, and it also enables, so it has robustness at scale, and so it deploys the state balance sheet to do that, but also other private balance sheets are then happy to contract in that, and then of course they construct their credit system in a way that enables other people to kind of so structural reform is not something that happens at the stroke of a pen. It's something that happens. There's a reason why it's a dollar-based system, and there's a reason why, Kindleberger at some point compares the SDRs to Esperanto, and he says, if this is it has this kind of artificiality to it, and there's a good reason that Esperanto as a sort of top-down project failed. Now, none of this is to say that the dollar system is, of course, ideal, and it's weaponized in all kinds of ways. But I think studying the dollar system gives us, especially in the global south, ought to give us a set of design principles that we can then think about how to organize and democratize in a different way, right? So if a national balance sheet is going to provide a global public good, this dichotomy, as it were, we have that in domestic credit systems as well. Most money is bank money, but we regulate banks, and in India and China we nationalize them. Of course, you can't do that where a subunit, you sort of take that system to a global scale, where you have a subunit issuing a global public good. And of course, that's a big problem, and on one level, geopolitics is going to have to play the role of regulation to lean against that. But I think also we have to figure out how. So I don't think the SDRs are going to work as a real alternative, and nor do I think, even if we could get the collective action right, a kind of BRICS currency or a kind of consortia of nations is going to work either. And the star witness there, of course, is Europe, right? Europe has spent 2 or 3 generations at this point attempting to do collective action with all the incentives and all the kind of, and of course, the people of Europe don't want to be the United States of Europe, but they still haven't managed to construct in a robust political way. I mean, the solution to large-scale collective action for me is the state. And that is because it creates a kind of compulsory but legitimate organization that then can operate at scale and solve collective action problems. That's what you need for liquidity provision at a global scale. So anything other than a state, for me, is not going to do it. Not a fund is not going to do it, nor a consortia of states is going to do it. So very few states are going to be able to do it. It's going to be world-scale states, 20% of GDP, 25% of global GDP, right? So of course, then China comes onto the question, onto the table, and then the question becomes, and this is again a question in a Kindlebergerian spirit: is China going to allow its balance sheet, both the state balance sheet and that of its credit system, to function as a global public good? Kindleberger would call that leadership. Or is it going to be, slightly more malign? And of course, the U.S. has pivoted, I would say, between both of these positions as the kind of anchor point. It's obviously becoming more malign now. I noticed Leslie had hi Leslie. Leslie had a question already saying, if Trump is tearing this stuff up, is this now? Notice that the one thing he's quite bullish about is the position of the dollar. He doesn't want to. He's like, you get rid of the dollar hegemony, and I'm coming after you, which is quite inconsistent with an otherwise kind of potentially isolationist kind of position, right? So he's that axiom of empire he wants to sort of keep in place. So and for good reason. So I think when we're looking at alternatives to the system, I think perhaps we're looking in the wrong place. Not the wrong place, but I think perhaps it's much easier. You can see the governance structures, you can see the power expressing itself in unequal shareholding. Structure is harder to capture and therefore harder to reform. But I think the global south is not a homogeneous place. We have hierarchy, of course, within the global south, and we could have different zones of quasi-imperial preference emerging. The question for me is that those the big balance sheets in those zones, can they be persuaded to be to provide those global public goods in a slightly more leadership orientation, as opposed to a more malign hegemony orientation. I think that's where the stakes are more than perhaps all of the kind of important, but I think we give them, again, I speak as a progressive, we perhaps give them a little too much airtime. And this comes back to the issue, Chrissy, that you were talking about, why do we keep talking about this? I think one of the reason we keep talking about this is I think we keep making the same conceptual errors, right? We keep going back to Bancor, or we keep, Kindleberger talks about Triffin, Stamp, Posthuma, Rusa, Bernstein, Modigliani, Kennan. They're all trying to solve the same problem. How do we provide world money without the state? And I think the answer to that is we can't. And so that's a null set. There is no non-state world money solution. I could be wrong on that, but as I say, I'm encouraged dispute with that. But my sense is that but progressives still go back to like SDRs. Like let's do it. Let's do it really, really for real this time. And my sense is that we might be barking up the wrong tree.
Well, that's a provocation. Do either Robert or Andres want to respond?
No, I want to bring up a quite different point, but
okay.
next.
Andres, did you want to jump in?
Just quickly, I don't think SDRs are the solution to world money, but for short-term liquidity needs for countries, and not the unit of account or its monetary properties that may have some potential eventually, perhaps in a couple of decades. But they do provide a short-term solution, considering the embedded hierarchies in the current system. If you compare, for example, what I called a few years ago the monetary triage of the swap system that the Fed leads, that basically provides unlimited money to their friends and allies and no one else. The SDRs do provide some breathing space, not the SDR system itself, but the SDR liquidity or the issuance of SDR instruments in occasional times and so on, in crisis. They do provide that extra liquidity that are very powerful. And the fact that there is a renewed opposition to the SDRs within the U.S. Congress is a sign of something else as well, right? I mean, if the more hegemonic imperial forces are saying, "Oh no, we oppose SDRs," that brings up a warning sign and an encouraging term as well. So yeah, that's just as a quick response to Anush.
Go ahead, Anush.
Sorry, I don't want to go back and forth. But I mean, if I have a bunch of SDRs, I have to swap them for dollars. So there's got to be some market maker going two ways between SDRs and dollars. There's not a lot of those around. So it's like one more step and back in the dollar system.
Yeah, the dollars are the hard currency of choice. It is the hegemonic system. And it's okay if you trade them for dollars. But what I'm saying is that you do get an influx of liquidity that under the dollar current system and the swap system that the Fed leads, you won't. And that is an issue that helps you bypass the hierarchies or the preferences of the hegemon.
Right. So part of what the disconnect here is thinking about sort of short-term, breathing space versus long-term sort of changes to the structural system. Robert, did you want to jump in there with something else?
Yes. I wanted to refer to something which is really absolutely fundamental, right at the core of our current problems. But starting with this quote from Keynes, chronic payments imbalances are at the root of impoverishment and discontent and even wars and revolutions. And so, as everybody knows, so to speak, Keynes gave a great deal of thought on how to create a global economic structure which would provide pressures on both deficit countries and this is the key point, surplus countries to keep their deficits and surpluses low. And he failed at Bretton Woods. Harry Dexter White and the others were determined not to allow such a thing. And so Keynes came back from Bretton Woods saying that the most important achievement of Bretton Woods was to make what had been heterodox into orthodox, namely to make capital controls legitimate, because Keynes thought that capital controls were so important for allowing a democratic political system to exist at the level of the nation state. But we still have this problem, but it's become really acute now, with China running these huge surpluses and the US running huge deficits. But in the case of China, of course, it's not just running huge surpluses with the US, but it's also keeping consumption to GDP relatively low, investment to GDP at unprecedentedly high levels. And that means that China must be a very big exporter on a world scale, including to, of course, developing countries, which in turn makes many of them, it kind of locks many of them into the role of supplying commodities to China and inhibits their own industrialization. And so the question is, we have had this problem in place ever since Bretton Woods, whereby there is no pressure on surplus countries to reduce surpluses. All the pressure is on deficit countries to reduce deficits, except for one, which is the US. And that seems to me to be a really fundamental problem, that practically anything else that we talk about is relatively small compared to this problem. And unfortunately, I don't have a magic solution.
Right. As we've talked about, the way that the United States and, particularly the Congress and the Treasury are able to kind of put brakes on any attempts to reform. If a fundamental reform is saying, okay, there needs to be discipline of the behavior of the most important actors in the system, right? We already see what the kind of structural problems are there. So I guess part of the question then to pivot to, and Anusha's already pointed in this direction, I'll have two more questions and then we'll turn to some Q&A from the audience. So if I'm seeing some questions come in, if folks have other things they want to put into the Q&A. The first question is the extent to which, if we take the idea of reforming these institutions as, a goal that is shared broadly, both within and without, right? You see Georgieva herself say, we're taking up the mantle of reform, right? I wonder, one of the contentions that was raised in the first webinar by Adriana was the idea that reform pushes will necessarily come from outside these institutions. And there was a little bit of a debate whether that is the case. And so one of the things that we've gone through, that we've all lived through in recent years, and that feels like is an accelerating part of our daily lives, is the way that key external shocks have really impacted the system, right? Global pandemics, this turn away from quote unquote globalism and toward right-wing populism in the global north. And, the COVID crisis did lead to an increase in the issuance of special drawing rights, these kinds of questions. And so I wonder about how the influence of these increasing external shocks on this system, whether you think that this actually does open some possibilities for reform of these institutions, or does it just mean we're opening up new worlds in which these institutions will be increasingly sidestepped, both by the principles within them and by the actors who are sort of seeking to get around their rules? I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that question of kind of external shocks coming from the outside and what that might mean. Go ahead, Anush.
I can give it a go. Not the pandemic, but I think authoritarianism is not an external shock. Authoritarianism is endogenous to neoliberalism, and that it takes a while for it to express itself. One can go through various pathways from neoliberalism to authoritarianism, and happy to discuss that in Q&A. But I think that it is when you shred the social contract, and when you vilify the state and the public for a generation, and then you see massive inequality. There's some recipes there for for a certain kind of certainly a kind of populism and authoritarianism. So I wouldn't say that that's entirely exogenous. But the thing with vulnerability is that any shock, you're already on the edge, right? And so how part of the policy space that one requires is precisely the resilience to shocks, right? And what does that look like? Robert quite rightly mentioned capital controls. Every state that has developed, America included, has done so behind trade and capital controls. Of course, they can be used in better and worse ways, and they can sometimes shelter inefficiency and oligarchy. Often they do that. On the flip side, it's very hard to see how one can develop in the absence of those buffers. Now, of course, the East Asian and all these sort of export champions have taken the extreme step of creating buffers against shocks by, just piling up foreign exchange, and that again is only good. Only some countries can, by definition, be export champions. I think the way to so again, that's how I would respond vis-a-vis the vulnerabilities. You need forms of resilience, and how do you have that? So sometimes you need that individually, or sometimes you can arrive at that collectively. Of course, there's the Chiang Mai initiative. There are other initiatives, speaking strictly on the finance side, that are forms of collective action that can help you out in a kind of crisis. I think those will be certainly increasing. Those will have to be increased as and that's where things like the BRICS, I think, can play a role. They can be collective solutions, sort of in the last instance. But if not in the first instance, they can improve resilience of already vulnerable sort of countries when these shocks hit. Longer term, the solution, and this sort of responds a little bit to Robert's very important point, that these chronic surpluses are part of the seeding vulnerability in the system that makes us then more vulnerable to shocks. I think part of the solution there is what Robert himself has written about: industrial policy. You have to compete against China. You have to compete against the export. You have to spread the means of wealth, so that if they're not going to unilaterally draw back, and why would they? They are drawing millions of people out of poverty on the back of those surpluses. So they want to keep them going as long as they possibly can. Of course, subject to the system, the broader vulnerabilities that might seed. But I think it then becomes, as it was in the global north. I mean, this goes back to the New Economic Order and the creation of the Bretton Woods system itself. It is in the working class interest in the global north, and now increasingly in China, to develop the South. One doesn't have to do, or to aid in that development process. Doesn't have to be purely philanthropic. There is a mutuality here. We will import the capital goods. We will import the technology. We will import the know-how, which is embedded in workers' practices in the global north, into the global south. So there is a kind of worker-oriented mode of globalization. I think that we have not fully explored. It was there in the kind of, at various moments, of course, but as opposed to a more capital-oriented mode of globalization, and that, I think, will then also speak to these deeper imbalances, and also the vulnerabilities, Christy, that you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a really interesting example there from the first Trump administration, which was the renegotiation of NAFTA into what we call in the United States the USMCA, right? And one of the kind of key provisions there was Trump's assertion that the kind of wage differential across the border needed to be lessened. And so new reforms were put in place to make it so that the wage floor would come up in Mexico. And actually, you've seen kind of incredible advances. I have a dear friend who works in the Department of Labor precisely on these negotiations, where you actually do see advances in independent unionization. The minimum wage was raised massively in Mexico, and sort of bringing up that floor. And that was actually working for a minute, until now in the second Trump administration, he's just come in and blown up the North American supply chain for automobiles, into which all of those workers have been inserted by these neoliberal processes over time, right? So, I mean, part of the external shock is just like the pure, unpredictability of what's happening within the system with Trump at the helm. But I wonder, Andres, from where you sit, are the kind of increasing, accelerating shocks that we're living through, Is that propitious for reform? Does that mean we're sidestepping the issue of reform and just moving into other modes of, thinking about precisely the questions that you've raised, liquidity questions, the provision of credit, et cetera?
I think these the shocks that we're living through that go to the core of the international trading and finance system will generate some cracks and some opportunities for reform. Though I am not optimistic at all that it would lead to positive reform, but actually to backwardly reform, and that especially we will see a role for these unilateral coercive measures, right? I mean, you have to be really naive to think that these sanctions occur either because of, human rights violations or whatever. They occur precisely because those players at the bottom are daring to act unilaterally to go up the value chain, whether it's industrialization, whether it's, appropriation of knowledge, whether it's a collective action, or whether they're making too much noise in the international arena, or they're allying themselves with malign influencers, which is now the preferred language of the US hegemonic state. So these unilateral coercive measures are good evidence of those that dare to challenge the system, okay? And I'm not referring to purely political or ideological issues, but precisely technological, trade, and financial issues as well. So there's one example that interrelates what Robert and Anousheh emphasized, which is the issue of capital controls. And there is a little bit of literature, perhaps, Christy, you could look much more into this from the official historian at the IMF, that talks about how these coercive measures are not allowed by the Articles of Agreement, right? Because they are, in many cases, restrictions on the free flow of capital and in other case of even current transactions, right? And you are supposed to notify the IMF if you are in breach of these kinds of measures, especially if you apply them for economic, for emergency purposes, right? So even if you have if you have the grounds like the US does with their international emergency economic powers and so on to apply these unilateral sanctions, you are supposed to brief and notify the IMF so that the board can make a decision whether it's allowed or not, or whether they're gonna, allow for some flexibility or a transition period, or whether there can be retaliation. There's so many issues around notifying exchange restrictions, is what the formal term is called in the context of the IMF language. But this is not happening, right? So this is an example of how the rules of the game that are supposed to protect the integrity of the system as a whole are being breached by those at the top of the hierarchy, and that are being applied unilaterally in breach of the institutions that they themselves control and have veto power of. Right? And I think this is increasingly going to be happening, but it is not just a Trump 2 thing, okay? This has been happening at least since the 1980s, and I have recently studied, and it'll come out next month. We have a book on the political economy of dollarization and central bank economic policy in the context of dollarization. I studied the case of Panama, where in the late 80s, the US sanctioned Panama to provoke a balance of payments crisis, to provoke a financial crisis, to provoke, of course, a change in government and general policy orientation. But part of that was closing them from the US clearing system, of course, in breach of the US's obligations with the International Monetary Fund's article of the agreement, okay? So this is not just a Trump 2 thing. This has been around forever, and we have to be conscious of that context as well.
Yeah. I think I'll let Robert jump in here in a moment, but that final point really points to the idea that one of the big questions that we're starting this series with is does knowing that history, right, do anything? Does that change anything for us? Does actually understanding the history of the way that the system was developed, was challenged, has been changed, is sort of set aside from the top, is challenged from below, what that does for us. So I'll let Robert respond, and then I'll ask each of
So
you.
if you just allow me just
Please,
2
yeah.
seconds, surplus countries were mentioned here, and that's all on well that you have a nice surplus and you stash all this money in reserves somewhere. But then you have these measures that have happened, and Russia is perhaps the most recent news, but you've had that happening, with Venezuela, with Libya, and all these surplus amounts of money just gone because of the collateral coercive measures, right? So that also breaks and creates a choke point with regards to how useful is it to have these nice and big reserves if you're just gonna not misbehave with the powers that be.
Right. Robert, do you have a response?
Yes. So after the 2008 crisis, it's called the global financial crisis, but that's wrong. We should call it the North Atlantic financial crisis. The IMF reluctantly and gradually changed policy on capital controls. But the first point is that it never mentions the word capital controls. The accepted phrase is capital flow management techniques. And so this is to oversimplify, but basically the IMF policy on capital flow management techniques amounts to this, that they are legitimate for a national government to apply capital controls, in other words, both coming in and going out, can be applied provided everything else has been tried. So they're only to be used as, if you will, a last resort. And that's my understanding of basically the current position with reference to capital controls. But the larger context in which we're talking in this part of the session is a response to shocks. And so that brings up the G20. The G20, if you remember, was created after a great shock, namely the East Asian financial crisis, plus Russia, plus various other Latin American countries in the late 1990s. And that led to the creation of the G20 at finance ministers level. And then after the next great big shock, 2007 to 2009, that same set of countries was created as the G20 at summit level, at leader of government level. And I do think that this kind of body is potentially useful, and indeed it was useful after those two great shocks in formulating some degree of collective action for handling shocks of that kind. But there is a fundamental problem with the G20, and that is it has no representation system. And Danny Bradlow and I have just published at the website of Global Policy a short essay called How to Solve the Representation Problem of the G20. And the short answer that we give is for the G20 to follow the existing model of the Financial Stability Forum. The point being that the Financial Stability Forum has the same membership plus a few more countries as the G20, but it differs from the G20 in a fundamental way, namely that each member of the Financial Stability Forum, each country member, is obliged to create regional consultative groups in which are similar to the constituencies of the World Bank and the IMF. And the countries that are members of the Financial Stability Board are obliged. There are formal procedures for consultation with other countries that are not formal members of the board. And these regional consultative groups are chaired by the country that is a member of the Financial Stability Board, plus, and this is the important point, another country that is not a member of the Financial Stability Board. So there's a joint chairmanship of these consultative groups, which include not just the member country of the Financial Stability Board, but also a non-member country, to make sure that non-member voices are actually heard by the country that is sitting on the Financial Stability Board. So that's a short summary of the argument that Danny Bradlow and I made in this recent essay. So just back to the main point, which is that the G20 has proved to be useful in handling collective action in the wake of shocks, not necessarily so useful for handling more longer term issues like climate change, for example, but for handling shocks, that kind of forum has turned out to be quite useful.
Great, that's really interesting, and obviously gets a little bit beyond the kind of question of reform of the IFIs and speaks to
exactly
these other mechanisms by which the global economy is actually being governed, right? Not just through the Bretton Woods institutions.
Precisely. Just let me add, I used to be quite skeptical of the G20. In fact, have argued that it should be replaced by a properly constituted global economic council, somewhat equivalent to the Security Council. But I've now changed my mind. I do think that that kind of informal gathering really can add value. And I'm very worried at the rumors that the US, in fact, this is not just rumor, the US will refuse to host the summit next year. But then the rumor says that the US is seriously contemplating leaving the G20. And that, I think, would be a big mistake.
That certainly gets to some of the questions that have been asked in the chat, which I want to return to, but I want to spend 1 minute as we sort of close this portion of the webinar, returning to the question that we opened with, which is the question of the fact that these sorts of reform efforts do have this kind of long recurring history. And I've characterized this in this project as a little bit of a kind of Groundhog Day of reform, right? We just wake up every day and someone is saying, now is the moment we are reaching a consensus on IFI reform finally. And so when we started this project, right, this was last summer, the president of Kenya, William Ruto, published this piece in the IMF's flagship journal, really arguing that now we finally have the consensus for reform, right? And that just felt like, okay, we're just doing this over and over and over again. And so I wonder, from each of your perspectives, Robert having been inside the bank, Andres, pushing from outside from, a country government, Anush in the kind of political economy perspective, does that history matter at all? Like, is this just a kind of me as a historian wishing economists would read our work? Or is there any way that the kind of long history of sort of pursuit and failure, or, the attempt to reform and then having that be sort of incorporated but distorted over time, does that history matter? Or are we going to continue to live in this Groundhog Day every day? I don't know. Andres, what do you think?
Oh, wow, that's actually a hard question, I think it of course it matters, because if there's enough sort of illustration, and if all the actors were rational, they could learn from the mistakes of the past and so on. But with that history in mind, you also have, and I'm thinking here from a policymaker perspective, independently of their ideological tone, you have day-to-day needs, just like I mentioned. Hey, if I can get some more SDRs, bring it on. If I can get a Chinese loan, bring it on. If I can get a long-term, RST loan from the IMF, hey, welcome. I'm not worried about changing the international rules of the game. I have to feed my population tomorrow. I have a balance of payments crisis tomorrow. I have the price of my commodities with huge volatility today. I have to deal with day-to-day issues, and I'll take whatever I can get in the immediate sense without offending too many other people in the process, right? So I don't have time, even though I may be conscious of the historical issues, the need to reform, the need for collective action. I have these pressures from the day-to-day that will force me to act on whatever is on the ground available, right? And that's perhaps an important point in understanding why more or less issues around history are important, and perhaps also why when there was relative peace or calm in the financial markets and in relatively stable conditions in the first decade of the century, there was more creativity around thinking for alternatives like the Bank of the South, like Chiang Mai, and different ideas that were coming up that had the people empowered just a few hours a day to think about, oh, okay, so we're doing well, but we can do it even better if we work in that direction. So I think it definitely matters, but there are these pressing issues in the day-to-day that are a reality of developing and emerging world markets. Yeah.
Right. So in an emergency, nobody has time to read the history book. That's certainly the case. Anush, do you have a response to that question?
Yeah, and so I have the luxury of being an academic and thinking about things over a longer durée, obviously, but absolutely history matters, I think, for policy as well, because history is a laboratory. It's a laboratory of ideas, and it gives us a chance to kind of look at a very similar planet, which was us, through slightly different eyes. And why that's important, especially now, I think, is that it fuels our imagination. It's not that we're going to just take things off the shelf, of course. Not that things are exactly different, although they may rhyme, etc., etc. But at a moment of intellectual crisis now, where one paradigm has more or less cracked and is now on afterburners because we haven't really kind of, we're all assembling and trying to kind of figure out what comes next. It definitely feels like a kind of post moment. History is a resource. History is a massive resource to kind of, but it can also be, a little bit of an intellectual straitjacket, right? I mean, I refer to my comments about, it can go both ways. About the idea that governance will take us somewhere new, as opposed to what I call in the book mutualization, right? Collective action is going to happen because different balance sheets, different national balance sheets, different central bank balance sheets become jointly and severally liable, right? Germany is not willing to do that with the rest of the EU, so the EU is limited. But look at what happened with the swap lines. These are permanent swap lines now. They were emergency swap lines, but now the central bank, I'm referring to the central bank swap lines, where the five main central banks have essentially become almost sort of constituent Federal Reserve banks. So the EU is kind of like the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. It has access to India doesn't have that. But people further down the hierarchy don't have that. But that's real mutualization, right? That's not mere tinkering around the edges with governance reform. They have said we are jointly and severally liable for the dollar, and all of us are going to throw our shoulders behind that, right? So you need, and why that's important is because you need liquidity at two levels. You need liquidity for day-to-day life, as Andreas was saying, but you also need emergency liquidity. And the thing about emergency liquidity is that you need a lot of it immediately. So who can do that, credibly? Very few people can. The other thing that we need, which again history shows us, there's lots of examples, Andreas mentioned a few of them, where we, from the global South perspective, UNCTAD was part of this, thinking about how do you get long-term capital flows to the global South, right, in a durable way, in a world where there is, in a world of capital controls, right? This is the inspiration for these institutions, of course, were to be investment banks, a bank for reconstruction and development. The point of this bank was to, we tie up private capital, but this is public capital. This was meant to be the development bank for the world, right? And to mobilize liquidity from across the world, but then deploy it long term in the global South to build us up. So these are, and it's in a lot of global South countries, central banks do take on developmental functions, right? So there's a blurring between the kind of short-term liquidity provisions and the day-to-day liquidity and the kind of longer-term thing. Of course, institutional capacity is scarce on the ground often in our countries. But I think both of the, we need, going forward, and of course history can be a resource here, but going forward, we need to think about how do we mutualize for those two problems that the global south are facing: the day-to-day emergency liquidity on the one hand and long-term investment on the other. These keep coming back because we still haven't solved them.
Yeah, I'm so struck by that because, in my first book, the kind of through line from what these Mexican economists and diplomats and statesmen are trying to do, really beginning in the 1920s, is to try to create some international institution that will coordinate long-term investment that will be used for production, for industrialization in Latin America and the rest of what will become the third world. And those are the proposals that they make in 1933 and 1936 and 1939.
And we still need that.
And we're still making them. And so to
Because
me, that question gets at the crux of what it is that we're trying to understand here, is the way that we continue to see those proposals, those needs coming from the global south, and how we have the insufficiencies in this system.
Absolutely.
Christine?
Robert, do you have anything to? Oh, sorry, I'll let Andres respond, and then Robert can have the final word here.
Yeah, because also I had a question for Robert, if you allow me. But
Great, please.
When Robert mentioned the fact of the G20 and the Financial Stability Forum, those are spaces that are not exactly Bretton Woods institutions. I mean, Financial Stability Forum is housed in Basel and has the BIS as the center point of the technical analysis and support for the decision-making processes there. And I think, and I see that we have in the audience Perry Merling. He always says, I'm more of a BIS kind of guy than an IMF kind of guy. And I like balance sheets, and I like the hierarchies there, and I like the money view, and so forth. And I think BIS, it's perhaps in historical terms and the political economy of its foundation and its current existence, perhaps even a more neutral space for understanding and the global phenomena, and also as a key sort of instrument for a more cohesive global system, given its long range. I mean, I do have my criticisms of Basel and the Basel agreements and the hegemonic views there as well. But even the governance issues, the political economy issues of the BIS itself make it more prone to become this more overarching and more inclusive space, even in the composition of its membership and so on. There is a historical reason for that. And I know, because I've talked to many central bankers that feel so much more comfortable dealing with the BIS bankers and the staff in Basel than dealing with the Washington institutions that are absolutely vertical and have this very hierarchical mentality. I don't know if, Robert, you could speak to that, or perhaps we can also discuss a bit.
Well, actually, I'm not going to speak to that. That's a very interesting point, but I don't really have anything to add. But on the point about this well-known process of repeated efforts at reform, which kind of flare up over time, but repeatedly, and don't seem to amount to very much. I'm wondering if the concept of organized hypocrisy might be useful for understanding. Commonly, what happens is that the efforts at reform are really directed by the powerful players, not by everybody, as a kind of a theater. That is, what matters is to be seen to be doing something, but not to actually achieving anything. And that's the point about organized hypocrisy. And therefore, there's a period of reform and nothing much comes out of it. And then 5 years later, there's another effort at much the same reform. But the point is that it begins from the same place that the previous one began from, and so on across time. And I want to go on and just to end on a note by questioning something that Anush said, because it's relevant in this connection. Anush mentioned in passing the Chiang Mai Initiative, and he might have mentioned, but I don't think he did, the contingent reserve arrangement, which was created by the BRICS as meant to be a kind of alternative to the IMF. And just as the Chiang Mai Initiative was meant to be an alternative to the IMF, or at least a complement to the IMF. But the basic point is that none of these, neither of those two, have amounted to anything. The Chiang Mai, the contingent reserve arrangement, which was created in 2016, exists on paper, but it's completely stillborn. The champion of the contingent reserve arrangement was the Brazil Finance Ministry. The opponent of the contingent reserve arrangement was the Brazil Central Bank. So it was blocked from within Brazil, basically. And so that's just an example of an effort to develop alternatives from within the Global South to the Washington organizations, which amounted to nothing, or to very little. The Chiang Mai Initiative amounts to a little, but basically it doesn't do any of what it was meant to be doing.
Thank you for that.
That's not an exact response, but I do think the concept of organized hypocrisy is relevant in this context. The powerful players have a distinct interest in being seen to be very concerned to bring about more equitable reforms without actually bringing about equitable reforms.
Right. And our colleague, Alex Kentelikenis, who also participates in this initiative, has actually taken the organized hypocrisy idea one step further. And he actually contends in his recent book, right, that the IMF is not just organized hypocrisy, that it has what he's called an escalating commitment to hypocrisy. And that's what we're living through. So that escalating commitment to hypocrisy is what marks this kind of long history of reform. I should say that he's the one who, when we presented, sort of within the History and Political Economy project, we said we want to think about the history of this. He was the most skeptical. He was like, nobody in the IMF is going to give a damn about history. They are not going to listen to anything that has anything, everyone is thinking very much in a presentist mold. And so we're very conscious that we are sort of swimming against the tide here in trying to have these conversations. And your point about Brazil is so important. And I can see that Adriana is in the audience and has asked a question. So I wish that she were actually a panelist and could participate with us as she did in the first webinar. We do have a few moments left, and there are a couple of questions. And I can see that Anush was particularly interested in answering a question from one of our audience members. So Anush, do you want to jump in here and say, go ahead.
Sure. So the question was from Leslie, who says, okay, everyone, so where does long-term capital come from? If the IFIs, at least in the Western linked ones, have decided they're not going to get more public money, therefore the only way forward is blended finance or public-private partnerships. So I think where does the finance come from today? So if you think of as Kindleberger and Salant did ages ago, it's the US economy that's the World Bank, de facto. And they borrow short in terms of, all banks borrow short and lend long. The US issues treasury bills. And then Wall Street does FDI. Put together, that is a banking operation happening and the question is, that's happening obviously on terms that are not fantastic for most of us. So the question is, how do we then build an alternative to that? The Bank of the South was mentioned. That's one kind of situation where you could have thought you can think of an alternative world where and of course this was part of the new international economic order, where commodity surpluses are mobilized in a certain way and then deployed long term, and you need all kinds of hedging mechanisms for that and so on. But in principle, the surpluses will have to come from surplus units. Domestically, those are savers, and globally, those are savers. And now we have savers in the Global South, right? Both the oil countries and the export champions. Can they be persuaded to do long-term investment? Now, China is already doing that. It's called One Belt, One Road. That's recycling their surpluses rather than putting it into treasury relatively short-term liquid assets. They're putting it into long-term infrastructure assets. Again, I frankly don't know enough about it to kind of take an educated view on it. But structurally, that's the kind of thing that we're going to need. Is a different kind of recycling of the surplus that is there with surplus countries, and different sets of balance sheets that are going to be able to do that.
Thank you for that. And I think one thing that this has really made clear is that we've opened up a whole set of questions that, an hour and a half conversation don't give us time to answer. But I am very grateful to all three of you for participating in this kind of initial set of conversations. As I said at the beginning, for folks who weren't here, this webinar series is intended to be a kind of kickoff set of conversations where we are trying to bring together folks who are actually working in the policy space like Andres, people who are academics like Anush and myself and Robert, and to think about how these long histories of pushes for reform, of reform efforts, right, might actually inform those ongoing questions. And today, we've really made clear that, focusing narrowly on the Bretton Woods institutions is only getting, a kind of one slice of the pie that is the governance of the global economy. And as the world, as Leslie's initial question about the changes in U.S. hegemony and what Trump is doing and the rise of China and all of these questions are sort of rapidly changing the today's world in which we're living. The question of sort of how we draw lessons from earlier moments, I think, becomes all the more complicated. And so we're going to continue these conversations. We're going to hold another webinar sometime soon, hopefully next month, that is about the way that sort of activist and NGO reform efforts, advocacy from the outside of the institutions, how we should understand that history from within. And then we will convene a sort of major conference on these topics next May. So again, thank you all so much for participating today. Thank you again to BU and the Global Development Policy Center for hosting us here. And we hope to continue this conversation with you all soon. Thanks very much.